By the 1930s, Stalin had turned political control into a campaign of terror known in the source as the Great Purge. Its central purpose was to eliminate resistance and suspected disloyalty, while securing Stalin's power as completely as possible. Inside the Communist Party, leaders and members considered threats were punished, exiled or executed, and the source places Leon Trotsky among the opponents driven out. Senior Soviet military officers were also targeted, including men who had served through earlier wars and were accused of espionage or counter-revolutionary activity. The campaign then reached intellectuals, writers, artists, and scientists whose ideas were judged incompatible with Stalin's political line. Mass trials, brutal interrogation, forced confessions, executions, and imprisonment in labor camps, known as gulags, became part of the machinery of repression. The result was not only the removal of rivals, but a society trained to measure every word, because an opinion could be interpreted as hostility to the regime. The source describes the psychological effect as a climate of fear, suspicion, and distrust that outlived Stalin's own rule. It also connects Stalin's policies to prolonged suffering, mass hunger, and the deaths of millions of people. That is the contradiction at the center of Joseph Stalin's story in this source. He became one of the most influential Soviet leaders of the 20th century, yet his path to power was tied to revolutionary violence, coercion, and immense human suffering. His life began far from the center of Soviet power, in poverty and instability, before carrying him into underground politics, and eventually the leadership of the Soviet state. To understand how that transformation happened, the story has to rewind from the fear of his rule to the boy he once was. Joseph Stalin was born with the name Iosif Vissarionis Djukashvili, and during childhood he was commonly called Soso. The source gives his birth as December 18, 1878, or December 6, under the older calendar, in Gori, Georgia, then part of the Russian Empire. He was the surviving child of Vissarion Djukashvili and Ekaterina Galadze, after two older siblings died while still very young. His mother worked as a homemaker and skilled seamstress, while his father earned a living as a shoemaker in another man's workshop. The family had once lived more comfortably, but an economic decline pushed them into poverty. Stalin's childhood was made harsher by his father's heavy drinking and domestic violence, which the source says was directed at both his mother and Stalin himself. In 1883, Ekaterina left Bessarion and took her son away, beginning a period in which mother and child moved repeatedly through rented rooms. After years of instability, they found lodging with a priest, and Ekaterina worked as a domestic servant while saving money for her son's education. Her hope was that Soso would eventually become a priest. In September 1888, when Stalin was 10, she was able to enroll him in the Gorai Orthodox Church school. He was remembered as a student who fought often, but he also performed strongly in class and showed talent in painting, drama, poetry, and church singing. His early adolescence brought serious physical hardship as well, including smallpox that scarred his face. At about 12, he was badly injured after being struck by a horse-drawn carriage, leaving his left arm permanently impaired. His academic record still earned him a place at the Russian Orthodox Theological Seminary in Tiflis in August 1894, supported by a scholarship. Among hundreds of other trainee priests, he initially achieved high marks and continued writing poetry. Under the pen name Soselo, some of his poems about nature, homeland, and patriotism were published in newspapers and later remembered in Georgia. But the path his mother imagined for him began to collapse as he lost interest in his studies and his grades fell. He repeatedly clashed with seminary discipline, received punishment, and was confined for breaking rules. The break became ideological as well. The source says he declared himself an atheist, refused to pray, and openly defied religious practices. At the same time, he joined a forbidden book club, read pro-revolutionary literature, and Karl Marx's Das Kapital, embraced Marxist ideas, attended secret workers' meetings, and moved steadily toward revolutionary politics. By April 1899, Stalin had abandoned the seminary and never returned. A few months later, he was working at the Tiflis Observatory as a meteorological employee, a light enough job to leave him time for political organizing. He built support among socialist workers and helped organize a secret May Day gathering in 1900 that encouraged a large strike. The Imperial Secret Police, the Okhrana, moved to arrest him in March 1901, but Stalin escaped and went underground. Even while hiding and depending on friends and sympathizers for support, he helped organize another May Day demonstration in 1901 that drew roughly 3,000 people. That demonstration ended in clashes with the authorities, and Stalin responded to the intensified manhunt by using aliases and changing apartments constantly. His activism helped him win a place on the Tiflis Committee of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, or RSDLP, in November 1901. He kept organizing strikes and demonstrations, including actions around oil facilities, even as arrests closed in around the people working with him. One later mass protest ended with police opening fire and killing 13 demonstrators, and in April 1902, Stalin was finally arrested. In 1903, he was sentenced to 3 years of exile in eastern Siberia, but he did not remain there for the full term. After one failed attempt, he escaped and returned to Tiflis, where he resumed party activity and worked on a Georgian Marxist newspaper. His arguments over the relationship between Georgian Marxists and their Russian partners nearly got him expelled, but he withdrew the position and stayed in the movement. In January 1905, government forces killed protesters in St. Petersburg, and unrest spread across the Russian Empire. Stalin was in Baku when ethnic violence between Armenians and Azerbaijanis erupted, and the source says he witnessed the brutal consequences of that conflict. He condemned Tsar Nicholas II and began organizing Bolshevik fighting groups as unrest spread through Georgia and the Caucasus. Those groups disarmed local police and soldiers, raided government weapons stores, and raised money through protection schemes aimed at large businesses and mines. Stalin also used the forces in violent confrontations with pro-imperial groups, turning political organization into an increasingly armed struggle. In late 1905, Georgian Bolsheviks chose him as a delegate to a Bolshevik conference in Finland, where he met Vladimir Lenin for the first time. He respected Lenin deeply, but he did not agree with every tactic, including Lenin's support for taking part in elections to the Imperial Duma. In April 1906, Stalin traveled to Stockholm for the 4th RSDLP Congress, where the majority opposed raising funds through armed robbery. Lenin and Stalin rejected that restriction and discussed continuing armed expropriations for the Bolshevik cause. Outside politics, Stalin married Kato Swanidze in 1906, and their son Yakov was born the following year. By 1907, Stalin had become a prominent Bolshevik in Georgia and attended the 5th RSDLP Congress in London. After returning to Tiflis, he helped organize the robbery of a large imperial bank shipment in June 1907. His group attacked an armed convoy with gunfire and homemade bombs. The source says 4 guards were killed while Stalin's conspirators escaped alive. Stalin then settled in Baku with his wife and son, while factional conflict between Mensheviks and Bolsheviks deepened. Even after disputes inside the RSDLP, he retained influence over the Bolshevik branch in Baku and continued editing Bolshevik newspapers. Kato died in November 1907, and Stalin left Yakov with her family before returning to political and criminal organizing in Baku. He gathered a group known as the Outfit, which raised money through protection, counterfeiting, robbery, and even kidnapping children of wealthy families for ransom. In early 1908, Stalin met Lenin and the prominent Marxist Georgy Plekhanov in Geneva, but the meeting left him dissatisfied. Back in Baku, he was arrested in March 1908 and held in prison, where the source says he continued recruiting Bolsheviks, organizing discussions, and ordering violence against suspected informers. He received a 2-year exile sentence in the Vologda region beginning in 1909, but once again, he escaped. During one escape, he reportedly disguised himself as a woman and reached St. Petersburg without attracting suspicion. He was arrested again in March 1910, sent back into exile, entered new relationships, and according to the source, fathered another child named Konstantin. Family life still did not displace revolutionary work, and after another escape he was quickly recaptured and given an additional 3-year sentence beginning in 1911. Even in exile he maintained contact with Lenin, and in 1912 Lenin and Grigory Zinoviev invited him onto the new Bolshevik Central Committee. The source says Lenin valued Stalin's Georgian background because it could help the Bolsheviks build support among ethnic minorities of the empire. Stalin accepted and remained connected to the Central Committee for the rest of his life. He escaped again to St. Petersburg in February 1912 and worked on turning the weekly Bolshevik paper Zvezda into the daily newspaper Pravda. Another arrest in May 1912 brought a new Siberian exile sentence, followed by another escape with a fellow Bolshevik only weeks after his arrival. Back in underground work, Stalin helped edit Pravda anonymously and traveled while researching an article titled Marxism and the National Question. Lenin supported the article, which appeared in a Bolshevik journal in 1913, under a pseudonym Stalin had begun using the previous year. The source explains the name as deriving from the Russian word for steel, reinforcing the image of Stalin as a man of steel. Before the article appeared, he had already been arrested again in February 1913 and sentenced to 4 years in the remote Turkhansk region of Siberia. Authorities later moved him still farther north to Kurega near the Arctic Circle, where escape was far more difficult. There he remained, entered another relationship, and according to the source had a son named Alexander, born in 1917. While Stalin was still in exile, Russia entered World War I, and exiled Bolsheviks were eventually called for military service. In February 1917, a medical examination declared Stalin unfit for military duty because of the damaged arm he had carried since childhood. Rather than return immediately to complete his exile, he negotiated a government assignment nearby, just as Russia approached a political explosion. World War I had already transformed Russia by the time Stalin's exile was nearing its end. His damaged left arm kept him out of military service in February 1917, leaving him close enough to events that were about to overturn the state. Soon afterward, the February Revolution erupted in St. Petersburg, and Tsar Nicholas II abdicated as the imperial system gave way to a provisional government. Within the Bolshevik Party, Stalin's standing was already significant. The source places him third in a Central Committee election behind Lenin and Zinoviev. He helped organize the armed demonstrations, known as the July Days, against the provisional government. When the authorities began hunting Lenin after the unrest, Stalin helped hide him and temporarily took a larger role in directing Bolshevik activity. Lenin was already planning to overthrow the provisional government, and Stalin supported the plan together with Leon Trotsky. After winning majority support inside the party, the Bolsheviks moved forward with the seizure of power. In the early hours of October 25, 1917, after a Central Committee meeting at the Smolny Institute, Bolshevik forces began taking control of key sites in Petrograd. They seized power stations, the main post office, the state bank, the central telephone exchange, and bridges across the city. The Bolshevik-controlled cruiser Aurora fired toward the Winter Palace, where representatives of the provisional government had gathered. The operation succeeded, the government leaders surrendered and were arrested, and on October 26, Lenin declared a new government led by the Council of People's Commissars. Stalin became part of the small inner circle, directing the new state alongside Lenin, Trotsky, and other senior Bolsheviks. His public profile was lower than Lenin's or Trotsky's, but the source emphasizes that he was involved in important government decisions and had unusually direct access to Lenin. He joined Lenin in measures against hostile newspapers and helped lead work on a constitution for the new Russian Soviet state. Stalin also strongly supported the creation of the Cheka, the Bolshevik secret police, and the campaign of political repression and executions described in the source as the Red Terror. As People's Commissar for Nationalities, he signed a decree promising ethnic minorities the right to separate and determine their own future. The Bolshevik leaders hoped those groups would remain within Russia, but Finland declared independence in the same period. Stalin's department nonetheless continued allocating support for Finnish residents, including funding for schools and press facilities. With Russia still at war against Germany and Austria-Hungary, the Bolshevik government moved from St. Petersburg to Moscow in March 1918. Stalin and Trotsky moved with Lenin and lived and worked from the Kremlin as the military situation worsened. Stalin backed Lenin's demand for a separate peace with the Central Powers, even though it required major territorial concessions. After months of internal argument, the government accepted the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and Soviet Russia withdrew from World War I on March 3, 1918. The territorial and economic losses angered opponents on both the right and left, helping drive the country towards civil war. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk ended Russia's participation in World War I, but the concessions it imposed deepened anger against the new Bolshevik government. As civil war spread, food supplies became a critical problem, and in May 1918, Stalin was sent to Tsaritsyn to control grain procurement in southern Russia. He treated the assignment as a chance to prove himself as a commander and took control of regional military operations. There, he formed close relationships with military figures such as Klement Voroshilov and Semyon Badiani, men the source describes as important to his later support base. Stalin sent large Red Army forces against anti-Bolshevik white forces, but his tactics produced heavy losses for the new government. He also ordered executions of people suspected of counter-revolutionary activity, sometimes without trial. Military institutions and middle-class opponents of grain procurement were purged, and the source says some were executed outside normal legal process. Stalin's use of violence went beyond what other Bolshevik leaders had authorized, and he even ordered villages burned to enforce compliance with food procurement. Lenin rebuked him because the tactics had caused far more casualties than expected. Despite those conflicts, the source credits Stalin with an important role in the Bolshevik victory as the Civil War turned decisively in their favor by the end of 1919. In February 1920, after receiving the Order of the Red Banner, Stalin became head of the Workers' and Peasants' Inspectorate and was then sent toward the Caucasus Front. Conflict with Poland developed into the Polish-Soviet War, and Stalin was transferred to the Southwestern Front in Ukraine. Red Army forces retook Kyiv and pushed Polish forces back, but the Central Committee then decided to carry the war into Poland itself. Stalin warned that the Red Army was not prepared for that offensive and argued that Polish workers would support their own government rather than a Soviet advance. Lenin and the Central Committee proceeded anyway, forcing Stalin to support the operation. In August 1920, Polish forces stopped the Soviet advance and won the war, matching the risk Stalin had predicted. Stalin was blamed by several leaders, including Lenin and Trotsky, and after feeling humiliated, he asked to leave his military position. He remained People's Commissar for Nationalities and continued working on Soviet efforts to bring neighboring territories under Bolshevik influence. During a return to the Southern Caucasus, he reconnected with his eldest son Yakov and brought him back to Moscow. Stalin also married Nadezhda, and their son Vasily was born in March 1921. Even as the Civil War faded, Russia remained unstable because food procurement policies had produced rebellions and political conflict. Inside the party, Lenin and Trotsky also clashed over policy, and Lenin increasingly supported removing Trotsky from positions of influence. In the following period, Lenin backed Stalin's appointment as General Secretary of the party, giving Stalin a newly important organizational position. In May 1922, Lenin suffered a stroke that left him partly paralyzed. During Lenin's illness, Stalin remained one of the people closest to him and visited him frequently. The source says Lenin twice asked Stalin to obtain poison so that he could end his life, but Stalin refused and ignored the request. When Lenin died in January 1924, Stalin took charge of funeral arrangements and helped carry the body to the mausoleum in Red Square. Publicly, he appeared mournful, while the source claims privately he was pleased by Lenin's death. The empty leadership position intensified factional struggle, with Leon Trotsky emerging as Stalin's most dangerous rival. Trotsky criticized Stalin, but Stalin's network of supporters kept expanding while Trotsky became more isolated. By the end of that struggle, Stalin's influence inside the party and government had become strong enough to shape the next stage of Soviet rule. Lenin's death left no uncontested successor, but Stalin entered the struggle with a growing network inside the party apparatus. Trotsky remained a major rival and attacked Stalin's political direction, yet the source describes Trotsky as increasingly isolated while Stalin's influence expanded. By the beginning of 1928, Stalin was controlling most of the government's direction and turned his attention to the countryside. He traveled to Novosibirsk and accused agricultural middlemen and wealthier peasants of withholding grain. Arrests followed, grain was seized, and Stalin announced that richer peasants and even middle peasants could be forced to surrender harvests to feed the rest of the population. In January 1930, accusations of hoarding became part of a broader campaign against the kulaks, with many families deported to distant parts of the country or to camps. The source says large numbers died during those journeys and that by July 1930, more than 320,000 households had been affected by dekulakization. These policies produced armed resistance in the countryside. When violence became politically costly, Stalin publicly described collectivization as voluntary and blamed coercion on local officials rather than on the central policy. At the same time, he launched the five-year plan as a radical effort to transform the Soviet Union from an agrarian state into a major industrial power. The plan set ambitious targets for factories, infrastructure, and production across multiple sectors. The source credits the program with helping make the Soviet Union a leading industrial power, while also emphasizing severe social costs, including hunger and widespread hardship. Stalin's control extended into culture as the state tightened supervision over art, literature, and the media. Artists and writers were expected to follow Communist Party ideology, while works considered hostile or unacceptable could be banned or destroyed. Foreign policy was also shaped by Stalin's effort to protect Soviet interests and expand Soviet influence. Between 1939 and 1941, the Soviet Union entered a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The source presents that agreement as an attempt to gain greater stability along a Soviet frontier before the relationship collapsed with the German invasion. Within the Soviet Union, Stalin's most feared instrument of political control became the Great Purge. The campaign sought to eliminate suspected opposition and disloyalty, and to secure Stalin's authority against rivals inside the Communist Party. Party leaders, officials, and figures associated with opposition were punished, exiled, or executed, while Leon Trotsky remained a central symbol of opposition outside Stalin's control. The purge also devastated the military, where senior officers were accused of spying or counter-revolutionary activity, and were removed, imprisoned, exiled, or killed. Intellectuals, writers, artists, and scientists were targeted when their ideas were judged incompatible with Stalin's ideology. Mass trials and brutal interrogation were accompanied by confessions that the source says were often obtained through torture. Many prisoners were executed, while others were sent to concentration camps or forced labor camps known as gulags. The repression spread fear through ordinary society, making people cautious about speech, association, and even private opinion. The source connects the broader Stalinist system to hunger, prolonged hardship, millions of deaths, and a deep psychological legacy of suspicion toward government. Then, the danger from abroad became immediate. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany broke the Non-Aggression Pact and invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa. The source says Stalin was initially shocked by the scale of the attack, but soon moved to direct the Soviet defense and mobilize national resources. He worked with senior commanders, including Georgy Zhukov, to organize resistance and plan counter-offensives. Battles such as Stalingrad and Kursk became crucial turning points on the Eastern Front and changed the momentum of the war. After Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, the Soviet Union became a de facto ally of the United States and Britain in the wider war. Stalin joined Allied diplomacy through major wartime conferences, including Tehran in 1943 and Yalta in 1945. He formally made himself Supreme Commander of the Soviet Armed Forces, concentrating strategic and military authority in his own hands. His wartime role therefore combined political leadership, control of military strategy, and the enormous mobilization required to defend the Soviet state. The Soviet advance against Nazi Germany became one of the defining achievements associated with his rule in the source. Yet the same period cannot be separated from the repression and suffering that had already transformed Soviet society before the invasion began. Victory would make the Soviet Union one of the world's principal powers, but it would also carry Stalin's system of power into the post-war order. By the end of World War II, Stalin held supreme military authority, and the Soviet Union had emerged as one of the world's major powers. The source credits his wartime leadership with helping defend the Soviet Union from Nazi invasion and with shaping the geopolitical order that followed the conflict. After the war, Stalin's role expanded from national survival to the construction of a new Soviet sphere of influence. He participated in Allied conferences such as Yalta and Potsdam in 1945, where post-war arrangements and influence in Eastern Europe were debated. Those agreements and competing interests helped create the tensions that became the early Cold War. Stalin used Soviet political and military influence to support pro-Soviet governments across Eastern Europe in countries including Poland, Romania, and Czechoslovakia. This network of communist governments became the Eastern Bloc. Defeated Germany was divided into occupation zones controlled by the Soviet Union, the United States, Britain, and France, and the Soviet-controlled eastern area became Communist East Germany. After the United States demonstrated the atomic bomb in 1945, Stalin ordered the development of a Soviet nuclear weapon. The source describes the resulting nuclear arms race between the Eastern and Western blocs as another major force intensifying Cold War tension. For all the controversy surrounding his rule, Stalin had presided over a transformation that left the Soviet Union recognized as a superpower. His political career ended with his death on March 5, 1953, at the age of 74. The source says he had already suffered a stroke, while information about his health was kept secret within a small inner circle. Rumors and conspiracy theories later questioned whether his death had been natural, but the source concludes that the available evidence pointed to illness. Stalin left behind a legacy defined not only by industrial and military power but also by repression, political purges, and terror. After his death, later Soviet leaders, especially Nikita Khrushchev, openly criticized parts of his rule during the period of de-Stalinization. Details of political repression were exposed and official discussion acknowledged injustices committed under Stalin. His legacy also remained embedded in the Soviet-dominated states of Eastern Europe and in the communist political systems established there. Later, Soviet leaders changed policies and styles of leadership, but Stalin continued to be a central reference point in Soviet history and ideology. The psychological effects of the purges also persisted, leaving social fear and distrust that required years to confront. Even after the Soviet Union disappeared, the source argues that Stalin's legacy continued to shape how people around the world viewed communism, socialism, and modern political history. The final picture is deliberately mixed. Stalin is presented as a leader connected to Soviet industrialization, wartime victory, and superpower status, but also to coercion, repression, suffering, and damage that lasted long after his death.